Welcome to our next session. We're talking about delivering on our promise to patients, how life science organizations can create value for patients just beyond the lab. And a big part of the focus of this particular session is going to be talking about how we can connect early and often with the patients that ultimately we're looking to serve. Depending on the organization, there's been a lot of analysis and banter about organizations that may start up in the biopharma or medtech space, and their communication around their programs are largely directed at investors. And there are times when we get very, very close to having a product on the market where the organization finally starts engaging the patients. In the last several years, there's been a big shift, and the organizations that are making this shift to actually engage with their community, the marketplace that they would ultimately serve, the patients, the caregivers, the advocates, the organizations, they're being applauded by the community. Because after all, if an organization has a real commitment to a patient audience and wants to solve a very difficult medical problem, wouldn't it make sense to show their commitment to that relationship long before there is one that's related to a transaction? In other words, a product getting, in fact, into a patient with some sort of monetary exchange along the way. So we've got some really great folks who are going to join us today, and we're going to talk a bit about creating this value and how you might want to think about these functions, advocacy, interactions with patient organizations and beyond in your company. So the first panelist we're going to bring up is Jessica Riviere. She's heading up an incredible function at Ultragenics. She's got a great history. I'll let her tell you about it, but Jessica, welcome.
Thank you.
It's great to have you here. So you've got a really cool background. Why don't you tell us a little bit about the journey, whatever you're comfortable with?
Sure. Hi, everybody. I came to patient advocacy really from a political background. I worked in the U.S. Senate and worked with a lot of the different stakeholders in the healthcare arena. I'm going to date myself, but I was working back in the Clinton administration when it was the healthcare reform plan at the time, and I worked in the U.S. Senate. We worked with a lot of different groups, everybody from hospital associations to patient advocacy groups to tech companies, everyone that had a stake or a position on healthcare reform and how it would impact them. And I really saw kind of the power of communities to drive policy, to drive change, and really all varying levels of sophistication, from mom and pop organizations to organizations that have multi-million-dollar budgets and large staffs. And so in 2005, I joined industry in the HIV and AIDS space. And if you know anything about patient advocacy, they're probably the leaders and the champions, early champions of this work, and have really worked to hold industry accountable and hold other stakeholders accountable, whether it's payers, regulators, researchers, and have kind of evolved in that. And I currently lead the global patient advocacy and patient engagement function at Ultragenics. We are focused on rare and ultra rare diseases. It's a little bit of a different animal. You're dealing with really, really small communities. We have a marketed therapy, for instance, that there's probably less than 100 people in the world that are living with this condition. So it takes on a different perspective. And like, bigger diseases like in cancer or diabetes, where there's a lot of people and a lot of vested stakeholders, some of these rare diseases don't have the same kind of bandwidth, awareness, access. And so it creates some different challenges than in some of the other spaces that I've worked in, but incredible passion, determination. And I can give you, as we have this conversation today, some examples that are really quite amazing of what has come out of the rare disease. But I would say a lot of that was built on the passion and the leadership that we saw in the early days with the HIV and AIDS advocates.
Well, we're excited to hear more about that. And rare disease is such a big topic in the industry right now. We've got a lot of organizations that are looking at that. And certainly with some of the work that's going on with PDUFA 7, I'm curious to see if that stimulates further investment in helping to solve these problems that affect the precious few, but they're precious patients, that's for sure. Okay, continuing actually on the rare disease topic, I want to bring up Alan Gilsgrab of Akuos. Alan's been doing some really cool things. I've gotten to know him over the last several years, and you're passionate for patients for sure, Alan. But you also have a real passion for helping to project the message of the patient advocacy role within life science organizations in some of the talks that we've done before, and we really appreciate that. So I wanted to say welcome, and could you share your background with the audience?
Thank you, Frank, and thank you for having me. I always learn so much from these conversations, and so although I share my experience, I also leave this conversation with something new. So thank you. Like many of you, I've grown up in the pharmaceutical industry with sales training, sales marketing, sales management, and it was an experience that I had at Genzyme. As a salesperson for Thyrogen, after my wife had gone through the diagnosis and treatment for thyroid cancer, where somebody said to me, you would be really good in this patient advocacy role. So a little over 15 years ago, I joined advocacy at Genzyme, not knowing a whole lot about what advocacy was other than my own personal experience with my wife, and I've really found my home. I've really connect well to the patient experience, and I love and get so much value out of helping my colleagues to connect to the patient experience as well. And so I'm excited to talk a little bit more about that today. Right now, I'm at a company called Akuos. I've been here a little over 2 years. We are a startup organization working for the first time in my working preclinical. So we're in front of our phase 1 clinical trial in a ultra rare genetic form of deafness, and just working to connect with the patient community and to connect my colleagues to the patient experience so that it informs our work. So I'm glad to be here today.
Well, it's great to have you for sure. And I want to bring up one more expert on the topic, and that's Todd Bledsoe of Neurocrine. So Todd, welcome to the summit.
Thank you, Frank. I really appreciate it. Good morning, everyone. Todd Bledsoe. As Frank said, I head up our patient engagement, patient advocacy team here at Neurocrine Biosciences. I've been in the industry better part of 19 years now or so, a variety of roles, various size companies. Neurocrine's a mid-sized biotech company based in San Diego, and certainly not speaking on their behalf today, but more so in a personal capacity, but also as an advocate myself. We've touched a little bit on rare disease, and I've been fortunate to work in that space for a better part of a decade or so, but I'm also a family member of a person who lives with rare disease. And so I've often said, anytime that your personal passion and a professional opportunity can match up, then you're really in your sweet spot. And so like Jessica, I spent my share of time in Washington, D.C. as well. Had the privilege of serving in the Clinton administration. I was at the White House for a couple of years, and then returned to my home state of Kentucky. I was the governor's deputy chief of staff. So did the public sector deal until moving over to industry 18, 19 years ago.
Well, very exciting, Todd. That's a really cool background, and thank you for the public service for sure, and welcome to the other side here in life sciences for sure. So Jessica, I'm going to have you lead us off here. You did touch upon your history in industry, but also prior to industry. So it would be great for you to maybe share your perspective on when you think of the role in contemporary biopharma and medtech companies today, that role of patient advocacy, that function. Maybe help us get up to speed based on maybe what we're seeing in our companies today. How is it different today than it was 10 years ago?
Oh, it's wildly different, I would say. I think that the function has really evolved, and I will credit that again to the patient advocacy communities who have really demanded a seat at a table that they haven't often been invited to. So if you think about the biotech industry, a lot of it has been built around the perspective of what physicians think. What do physicians want? from a therapy? What do physicians think about living with a specific disease? And we've really shifted that paradigm. And, there are a lot of people that will talk about patient-focused drug development. For many patient communities, it's kind of an aha. Oh, you didn't think about us before? And it's not that we didn't think about patient communities before, is that we're now using the patient experience, the patient perspective, the patient's needs and wants. What do you want from a therapy? What does good look like for you? What would it take for you to be in a clinical trial? What are the risks and benefits that you're trading off if you were a care partner for a child that doesn't have the capacity to make a decision about being in a trial? All of those kinds of things have really evolved in the past 10 years. I would say when I first joined in the HIV space, my boss said, if they don't chain themselves to the CEO's desk, trash a booth at a global meeting, and we're not on the front page of the New York Times every day, that's a win. So in essence, kind of like, how do we keep them at bay? And I remember saying, well, I can do a lot more than that. That's not really engagement. And so I would say it is really much more in the spirit of true partnership. Yeah. And that it's mutually beneficial. It's a give and take. There's no quid pro quo. This isn't about making ourselves feel good. This is truly in partnership, developing innovative therapies that respond to the needs of patient communities. If you're developing a therapy that you've never engaged with the community, and you've assumed that their number one concern about living with that condition is X, and you've actually developed a therapy that has nothing to do with X, you kind of missed the mark. And you spend a lot of time trying to market and build a community that's like, hey, we really care about the thing you now have developed and gotten across the finish line for FDA, even though you've never addressed what we really say are our key needs. So I would say that's the biggest shift. It is no longer, we continue to obviously to provide financial support and all of that, but the days of it just being like the feel good and, we bring in a couple of speakers a year and we provide, supports for galas and bikes and all of those. And those are important things. But the true essence of this is when a therapy meets, the finish line, that the community has been involved from early business acquisition and development all the way through post-marketing. And so that is a huge shift. And that requires a major culture change for organizations that don't really know how to do that. And what does that look like? And what does good look like? It also requires patient advocacy groups in many ways to up their games too. And not all of them are equipped to that. Not all of them know that there's a table, that there's a seat for them. So I would say it's changed dramatically in 10 years.
Thank you for that perspective. That's really, really helpful. And you use the term finish line. I think that's important to start way, way, way before that. So by the time we hit the finish line, everybody's ready and everybody's aligned. So Alan, I'd like to turn to you a bit in unlocking this value kind of beyond the lab and into the community. It is very, very encouraging to see several early stage C-level executives and investors appreciate this function, bringing it on early and engaging. So can you tell us a little bit about your perspective on what these executives are seeing? What were they so convinced of to put this function in very, very early, way, way, way before the finish line that Jessica described?
Yeah, I think Jessica said it very well. Thank you, Jessica. The FDA is focused more, and other regulatory agencies are focused more on the patient perspective now more than they ever have been. And they are encouraging through several guidances that they put out last year and other reports they've put out this year about the value of a PFDD or patient-focused drug development, meeting data collection as it reports on quality of life measures. So I think CEOs are seeing this movement and understanding that they have to include the patient voice in their work early, so that, as Jessica said so eloquently, it matters at the finish line. So if we develop a drug, and I've been in this situation where we were in a phase 3 clinical trial, and prior to the patient advocacy function really being engaged, patients were not talked to. Like, it was only physicians, like Jessica said, so that the trial ended great clinical results. So what quality of life measurements can we show to the FDA and to payers? Payers want to know, what's the value of this treatment? So you got it approved, but how is it going to change a life? And so that is where patient advocacy, and that's where the advocacy function really has added value to the work that we do, added value to the solutions and the products that we deliver at the finish line.
I appreciate that. Thank you. Todd, did you want to speak on that as well, in building on like the hallmarks of what a good function in this particular area looks like?
Sure. I think engaging early and often is key to that. And I think especially as companies are establishing a relationship with advocacy partners, especially if you're new to that particular therapeutic area, right? I mean, the reality is the trust has to be earned, and that takes time and it takes resources. And I don't mean simply financial resources. I mean, time is a resource. People are a resource. And I think having the types of people in these roles who have a skill set in which they focus not so much on but what I deem as the ROC, and that's the return on collaboration, right? I think one of the perhaps challenges that some people can experience in certain companies or in certain environments is if there is a lack of thorough understanding of what good patient advocacy looks like and how you try to quantify that internally, right? I mean, companies are often driven by metrics for reasons that we all understand, and understandably, some of this work is just harder to quantify, right? And so how can you provide that qualitative feedback? And I think one of the ways in which you can do that is looking for those areas of collaboration, right? How are we appropriately engaging with the community? What action steps are they taking? Whether that's through education, whether that's engaging appropriately with regulatory authorities, et cetera.
Thank you for that. And so, Todd, I'm going to stick with you and Jessica, and certainly then Alan, if you want to go ahead and weigh in on this. I thought from an update perspective, when we do think about this interaction with these, with the patient, with patient groups, with advocacy organizations, and leveraging some of your experience in the past with DC, is there anything kind of like cooking from a DC perspective that organizations may need to think about when it comes to strategically and from a compliance standpoint, what the patient advocacy function can do, the field of play with patients and the advocacy groups that are out there?
Yeah, not really. No healthcare issues being discussed in Washington these days. So no, in all seriousness, I mean, clearly COVID has dwarfed so many other healthcare issues that were already on the plate prior to this, right? And so I think understandably, everyone is eager to determine what does that public health system look like? What do some of the larger payer programs look like on the other side of the public health emergency? You know, I would say, I mean, one issue that I'm certainly hearing a lot about from the advocacy community these days is the future role of telehealth, right? And so for reasons that I think we all understand, there's been an explosion in the utilization of telehealth during the pandemic. It's not necessarily a bad thing. There are certainly a lot of benefits to that, and especially in the early days of the pandemic when literally there was no other option, right? When every physician office in the country was closed, but you're now seeing more people return to the office to return to that in-person care. And I think telehealth in some shape or form will continue to play a significant role in the delivery of healthcare in the country once we do get through the public health emergency, which I'm convinced we will get through at some point. But I think the fact remains that for some patients, the reality is telehealth may not be able to provide that optimal venue for care. I mean, it's simply not going to replace the benefit of an in-person physical examination, right? If you're living with a neurodegenerative disease, how on earth do you assess muscle mass through a video screen or even over a telephone system or over audio only? So I think what that framework looks like moving forward and ensuring that patients continue to have the ability to see their physician in person when they want to or when the physician deems it appropriate will be critical. That's an issue that Congress will be looking at in the coming weeks and months for sure.
Thank you for that. So Jessica and Alan, any additional comments on what Todd just set up?
I think the thing I would add is that COVID has provided an opportunity to see what's possible that we have often pushed back on and said, oh, we can't do it this way. Oh, we can't have people self-administer at home and all of those things. So I think we're coming back to an environment in where communities realize that the pushback that they received around, oh, you need to come into a doctor's office to get that injection, where actually now we can self-inject at home. I think you're going to see more. Yes, I totally get the telehealth, but it display itself in how we structure our clinical trials, the number of visits, the interventions that are required, all of those kinds of things, because in some ways we've broadened the playing field and we've broadened the touch points, and some people are now at the table that weren't at the table because of how the table was set before. So I would say there will be some policy changes that reflect the things that were possible during COVID that were exceptions, that exceptions were made, that people are going to now ask that be a permanent change and not an exception. We've shown that works, and now we want to keep it that way. And so I see that as a positive. But I think that's going to be a reality that a lot of our regulators and agencies and payers are going to be challenged with, because it's worked for 18 months now. Why are you saying we have to roll back the books and do it the way we used to if this has been effective? So I think that will be an interesting challenge for the landscape.
Alan, any thoughts and challenges?
No, I think Todd and Jessica were very eloquent, so nothing to add.
Okay, well, before we move on to kind of interacting and outreach that has to happen, since we're starting to address a little bit of the changes in so many things that the pandemic has forced upon all of us, and certainly what we do, maybe what we'll do is we'll take a quick pause here and say, maybe not so much DC, but maybe from a compliance perspective, in some organizations, there's great sensitivity about interacting before we have a product with any particular stakeholder. For organizations or executives that are reticent to maybe invest further or go all in on the patient advocacy function, does anyone have any advice on how others could coach those executives around them that do have this hesitancy because they think, with no label, with no approval, I'm just really afraid of interacting with groups and causing harm to the organization?
But I mean, I guess I would ask the rhetorical question, what's the harm that we're causing? We're not causing harm. We're providing information, and we're assuming that these communities don't have the sophistication or want to understand how drug discovery works. It's high risk, high reward. It's a long-term playing field. There are ups and downs. There are things that we can't anticipate. And to think that these communities don't have Google alerts so that when a company issues a press release and says, hey, we just bought an asset for $45 million in X disease, that these communities aren't aware of that. And so what I would say is, these are autonomous individuals, organizations. In many of these diseases, they are far more expert at these conditions than anyone else. And especially, I'll say this from a rare disease perspective, they know every clinical trial. They know the KOLs. They know the research that's been going on. They're in contact with other people in their communities that are navigating a similar landscape. And to think that we wouldn't want to engage with those people early, it is just mind-blowing to me. Like, you're losing and missing so much opportunity at the earliest stages of even, the mode of action. Is it going to be a pill? Is it going to be an infusion? All of those things that you can spend millions of dollars and you're way down the road. And then, you suddenly meet with people that have the condition or caring for somebody with the condition. It's like, oh my God, I didn't realize these kids were hyperactive and had cognitive displays. And guess what? A once a week infusion for 6 hours, probably not going to work.
Right.
Like, better to know that earlier in the trajectory. And you're only going to know that if you actually ask the people that are navigating this. And just looking at that through the investor lens or the physician lens, you're missing a huge piece of the puzzle. The end user, the person who's going to make the decision, that's going to be empowered to say, hey, I want this therapy for my kid. I want this therapy for myself. I want to participate in this clinical trial, and I'll take the risk because for me, the risk is worth it. And likewise, I want to also be empowered to say the risk isn't worth it for me. I'm going to hobble together whatever is the standard of care today, and I'm okay with that. So I think it's mind-blowing to me. It's kind of like manufacturing a car, but you've never driven a car. You've only you've only ridden a bike and you think bikes are great, but you're designing the next wave of a car and you have no idea what that means because you've never used it. So I use that, and it just seems so odd to me that the very customer and stakeholder that we're saying that we're designing our business model to meet their needs, and you don't have any interaction with them. How is that a recipe for success?
Mm-hmm. That's powerful. I can tell you, I had an experience where I was with an organization and we were interacting with a patient advocacy organization, and we were talking about, what does good look like and beyond. And you talk about participation. This organization called out like, hey, we're glad you're here and you're here early. Hey, by the way, that there's another company and they did not participate with our community at all until they got approval. And then it felt a little bit weird with them wanting to sponsor walks and be a part of different things with our community, kind of last minute when they had a motive. So the lack of participation, I think, is noticed as a good takeaway there. Alan, let me ask you a question about kind of getting noticed for the patient advocacy executives in life science organizations right now. That whether it's them themselves, the individual, or their company, doesn't have a relationship with some of the players in the advocacy space, with everything that's going on virtually, any tips or tricks on how we can reach out and have people actually turn on the webcam, respond to the email, take the phone call?
I know that's been a challenge for not only myself, but for some of my peers in the industry, particularly going into, we're all going into a hearing loss space, which is very new from a therapeutic standpoint. There's devices and hearing aids and cochlear implants, but there's no therapeutic interventions at this point. So it is difficult. I will say that Zoom is no replacement for a face-to-face interaction to build trust, to build a true partnership like Jessica spoke about earlier. And so as, and I'm just speaking for myself here, but I firmly believe that every player in the space, so the hearing loss space is my space right now. Every player in the hearing loss space should be at the table supporting these patient organizations. And I've been shocked to be at patient meetings where my competitors, my peers are not there. They're not at the table. So I've gone as far as to reach out to other peers and said, listen, I would love to introduce you to this patient organization. I feel like you need to be at the table. Another organization reached out to me and said, would you introduce me? We've tried to reach out through their Connect with Us, on their website. And gladly, I made an email introduction because I feel like, we should all, in advocacy, we should all understand that, there's not competition in advocacy. We should all be here to support patients the patient organizations, and do the best by them, our company and its competitiveness and its sales will all be handled at some point. But we have a responsibility to serve the needs of the patient organization. If we're going to call ourselves patient advocates and work in a role of patient advocacy, we have a responsibility. So I think it's up to all of us to bring each other to the table, to hold each other accountable, to act in ways that is the most appropriate. Like Jessica talked about earlier, we should be in partnerships, not just approaching a patient organization with request after request after request. It should be a partnership. And it's up to all of us to hold each other accountable.
I love that. We can, in the market, we can compete individually, but at some point there are functions that if we have a shared mission to improve and extend patients' lives, there's got to be collaboration amongst the industry, amongst the tribe, as they say. So Todd, how about other tips and tricks on making that connection, trying to form that partnership if it doesn't already exist? Any tricks, tips for the audience?
Sure. I mean, I think we've all heard the old adage, the best time to build a relationship is when you don't need it, right? And I think Jessica was spot on. I mean, our entire industry, frankly, is based upon risk and innovation, right? And so, yes, I think you can have calculated risk, and you can have an appropriate framework for when and how to engage with the advocacy community. And I don't want to be doomsday here, right? But you think worst case scenario, what happens when hopefully you do move into a commercialization, but as you're preparing to go to the FDA, if there's pushback from payers, if there's pushback even in the press around pricing or anything else, that's not the time, frankly, to be looking around and trying to find friends. It does take time. It does take again resources and ensuring that people in the advocacy community see us really truly walking the walk, not just talking the talk. And I think some of that, unfortunately, is because, and I think this is part of the broader evolution of patient advocacy in the last 10, 15 years, of how it has hopefully become more integrated into other aspects from R&D, the early stages of R&D, all the way through commercialization. And you think about the value that can be brought in terms of reaching out to patients, to care partners, around dosing, around, okay, clinical trial design, are we even moving in the right direction? Would this even matter to you? Are we looking, especially if you're talking about an ultra rare disease, where obviously not seeking patient identifiable information, but does an advocacy partner know certain geographies where there's a greater patient population, right? Well, we probably don't want to have the nearest trial site, 4 hours away from that location. So there are those daily tactical operational aspects of drug discovery that I think advocates can and should play an important role in.
Well, thank you, Todd. So we'll go around the horn here with the last question. This is really to each of you. So I'll start with you, Todd, then we'll go to Alan and then Jessica. So Todd, if you're going to give advice to the industry, give advice to our peers, when it comes to helping their organization really embrace the role of patient advocacy, and help people think about, this is the frame for value, this is the frame for impact, so the organization knows we're doing a great service. What advice would you have to those folks that they can communicate back to their company about that value?
Yeah, I think there is an appropriate way to tell that story without being incredibly self-serving, right, or self-promoting. I think most people are smart enough to see through that. But so, for example, I mean, even in the public affairs space, when you're talking about certain policy issues, of which often there are areas of mutual agreement with the patient advocacy community, I think appropriately informing our colleagues just on what the lay of the land is. I've often viewed my role as really a two-way intersection in terms of taking and providing business insights internally from what we're hearing, what we're seeing, what we're observing within the patient community, the organizations, the people themselves. But then secondly, turning that on the upside or wrong side out in terms of communicating to the community those priorities, plans to the degree that we can share certain things. I mean, I think my experience has been most advocates will recognize, especially in a pre-approval phase, there are certain pieces of information that simply cannot be shared, and for reasons that we all understand. And so I think having that two-way communication is key to the success.
That's great. Thank you, Todd. It's just communication remedies so many things that are out there for sure. So, Alan, it's your turn. Give us some advice on this, on the value function.
Yeah, in terms of showing value, like all of us, we have to set goals and objectives with our manager each year, and advocacy is no different. But what informs my goals and objectives are two things. The way I look at it. Number one, externally, does the patient community, does the and the individuals that I'm working with externally, do they see the company that I'm working for as a partner? Like Jessica spoke about earlier, it's a partnership, true partnership. We don't just write checks. We are in this with you. We are in the trenches. We're partnering around things that are important to both of us, mutual goals and objectives. Internally, has the patient voice, has the patient experience changed anything that we do? Has it informed our work? And then thirdly, internally, are all of my peers connected to the patient experience in some way? So that patient experience helps them to understand the value of their role, the significance of their role, and helping the overall organization accomplish its mission, and that's serving the needs of the patient community. So that's the way I look at value, and that's the way I show my value.
That's great. Thank you for that. And Jessica, your thoughts on the value, the progress, the impact equation. How do we communicate that internally? What advice do you have?
Well, first of all, I think it's a collective responsibility to work with patient communities. It shouldn't just be the responsibility of the patient advocacy function to bring in, quote, the voice of the patient. It's building that engagement plan from early acquisition through post-marketing commitments as to what are those touch points along the way that we need to understand the patient perspective and the care partner perspective to drive our decision making. And that's not 2 years before you go to market. That's across the continuum. That talks about access, clinical trials, pricing, patient services, patient education materials, all of those kinds of things. So it really is it's not just advocacy. Advocacy can be the conduit, the facilitator of some of those activities, but I need everybody in R&D to buy into that. I need everybody in market access to buy into that. I need the entire organization to buy into that. And if you don't have that senior level, leadership, executive suite leadership, you're going to spend a lot of time justifying what this function does. And we can't do it alone as a single function. It really has to be a collective and shared effort across the organization to truly believe that understanding that perspective is going to make us a stronger organization, and it's going to help us develop much more innovative therapies that are truly responding to the needs of people living with these conditions. And that's ultimately our goal. I would hope. And I say that as an individual, not necessarily someone who's working for Ultragenics, but that's what drives me. I want a patient who's living with a condition to know where there's support services, to have access to timely diagnosis. And should they and their healthcare provider decide that they're appropriate to either be in a clinical trial or take a particular therapy, I want them to be able to have the power to do that. And have the reimbursement to pay for that. That to me is the win. And maybe that sounds too, kind of aspirational and Pollyanna, but ultimately we're trying to work in partnership to create an ecosystem where somebody can thrive on living with a disease. And that's it. And by doing that well, your company will do well.
Mm-hmm. That's powerful advice. It's just we can invest big in the clinic, but we've got to be a part of the community in the conversation if we really want to deliver on that mission statement we've got on the about page on our company websites. That's for sure. So on that note, I just wanted to, on behalf of the audience here, Alan, Todd, Jessica, thank you for your time and your treasures today. It means an awful lot to us. You've definitely moved the conversation forward. And I think we've got some great notes to bring back to the organization this afternoon and next week. So on that note, again, Alan, Todd, and Jessica, thank you so much for your time. We appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Frank.
Thanks, guys. Okay, and on that note, we'll be moving on to our next session, industry update at the top of the hour. So again, thanks to our panelists, and we'll see you in the next session, everybody.